Many of you will be aware that it is esteemed or valued in our culture to have a strong and a confident sense of who you really are. To be and to express in your life authenticity. If you're not able to be authentic, if you don't convey a sense of being comfortable in your own skin, it may be your parents' fault. And it may be you need to get in touch with your feelings to find out who you really are. And if you're not able to access therapy, you can just watch Dr. Phil. It is valued in our culture to have an authentic sense of identity. Sometimes, though, it is very helpful to be able to at least project a different identity from what is your truest self. To project an identity which is at the very least surprising to those who know you best. Think, for example, of Superman, the comic book hero. How did Superman present himself in order to go through a normal daily life? As a nerdy, introverted, socially awkward newspaper reporter called Clark Kent. Quite the opposite of the strong man who can travel faster than a speeding bullet. Or how about the celebrity who is constantly hounded by crowds and media, who just wants to go out in public? What does the celebrity do? Probably put on some plain casual clothes and a hat pulled down low so that they can be disguised just to do what the rest of us consider part of our normal daily lives. Or perhaps the undercover police officer. The undercover police officer will present him or herself as a criminal. They will dress and speak and act like a criminal in order to lull the criminals into complacency so they might be able to catch them in the act of committing some kind of crime. Sometimes it is helpful to be able to present a different or a surprising identity of yourself. Sometimes we find this kind of identity surprise in the story of the Bible. Not that we find people dressing up to try and pretend to be something they're not. Rather, we sometimes find a stark difference between how the world looks at someone and how God looks at someone. We find a sharp contrast between how a person might look to others and who others think that person is, and who God knows who that person really is. And in seeing that difference between how we might look at someone and how God looks at someone, we find something important and even beautiful about the character of God. I'd like to give a couple of examples, one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament. From the Old Testament, there is a greatly important character who was just a shepherd boy who became a king. I speak, of course, of King David. Around 1000 BC, the nation of Israel had its first king, King Saul. King Saul was not faithful to God, and so God called to the prophet Samuel and said, "Go and find another king for my people." And the prophet Samuel went to the town of Bethlehem and to the household of Jesse. And Samuel asked to see Jesse's sons, starting with the oldest. And so one by one, from the oldest on down, Samuel was presented with Jesse's sons. By and large, they were strong, tall, good-looking young men. Good candidates for political leadership. But one by one, God said to Samuel, "This is not the one." And after Samuel had seen 7 of Jesse's sons, and none of them was found suitable, he asked Jesse, "Have you another?" And Jesse answered, "Well, I have just the one other. He's the youngest, the scrawniest, and right now he's out with the sheep, and I'll send for him." And when the prophet Samuel met David, God called to him and said, "This is the one." And lo and behold, that shepherd boy became the king of Israel. And even more than that, he became Israel's greatest ever king. A king remembered and revered to this very day. A few minutes ago, Larry read to us a passage from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. And in that passage, the prophet Ezekiel said, God lifts up the lowly. God can take a shepherd boy who is not even part of the royal family and make him king. God can and will make us whatever God wants us to be. No matter who or what we are, no matter what our sense of self-esteem, or no matter what others think of us, if God wants to lift us up, God will lift us up. You know, here in Canada, we once had a used car salesman who became deputy prime minister. We once had an immigrant girl from Haiti who became governor general. God can lift up whomever God wants to lift up. What a great word of hope this is to the lowly, to the poor, to the oppressed, to the downtrodden. God doesn't look at us how other people look at us. God sees things in us that no one else can see. And God will make us into whatever God wants us to be. It's a word of hope, and also a word of challenge to those of us who already consider ourselves wealthy or powerful or lifted up. I'd like to tell you also about an example from the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there is a story of a shepherd boy who became king. And in the New Testament, there is the story of a great king who is also our shepherd. The prophet Ezekiel said, I will raise up for my people a servant like David. And he will be their shepherd. And he will gather them from wherever they have wandered into the good pasture. The prophet Ezekiel lived 400 years after King David. He was not expecting King David literally to return. He was speaking in metaphor, telling God's people the good news that God would send another like David. And for we Christians, this word of good news was fulfilled in Jesus, who is on one hand a great King of all creation, the King of kings, the supreme human being who represents us to God, and also God in the flesh, who is God's representative to us. He is the King of kings, and yet he is also for us the Good Shepherd. I know some of you have seen the movie Good Will Hunting. I think I've referred to it in other ways previously. It's about a very troubled young man who is absolutely brilliant, among the most brilliant intellectuals on planet Earth. And yet, because of a terrible upbringing, he is a rebellious and dysfunctional young man. And finally, this young man, this tortured genius, is paired up with a therapist. And the therapist begins by asking, "What do you do for a living?" And the young man answers sarcastically, "I'm a shepherd." As if being a shepherd is the most ridiculous, sarcastic thing he could have answered. Who is a shepherd? What is a shepherd? Of course, in our society, there's almost no such thing, not even worthy of consideration. But even in antiquity, to be a shepherd was to be a lowly person. A shepherd lived outdoors. A shepherd often slept out under the stars. A shepherd earned very little pay. A shepherd earned absolutely no esteem. A shepherd was cut off from social interaction. A shepherd lived a difficult life of sacrifice, often having to put life and limb at risk to care for the sheep that had been entrusted to him or to her. And the New Testament wants to tell us that for God's people, Jesus is the Good Shepherd. There was a popular Christian devotional writer named Philip Keller. He spent most of his life in Canada, but actually had been born and raised in the eastern part of Africa. And in fact, he spent a number of years in his early adulthood working as a shepherd. And as he would spend long days and nights and weeks and months tending his flock, he began to notice how sheep are very much like people. Sheep are sometimes foolish. Sheep don't get the big picture of their existence. They are not capable of looking after themselves or being independent. Sometimes they wander or get distracted. Sometimes one sheep will be a bad influence on the others in the flock, and the behavior of the other sheep will start to drift and follow that bad influence. And yet the sheep are delightfully unique. They have their own personalities. They are lovable. They tug at the heart. And from his experience as a shepherd, Keller began to see in a richer sense what it means for the Bible to say that Jesus is the Good Shepherd. Keller writes something like this: Jesus, the Good Shepherd, chooses us. He calls us by name. He gathers us when we have wandered. He lays down his life for us and cares for us. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, willing to set aside wealth, power, social connection, esteem, safety, and security in order to look after we who are his sheep. And why? Because God called and sent him. Because he is God in the flesh. I was recently reading an article by an American theologian called Daniel Clendenin. It was about the care of the poor and the oppressed, and why God calls us as Christians to ministries of service. And he said something like this: we are to care for the poor and the oppressed and the downtrodden, not because we ought to hate the good things in life, not because we have some false ideal of human community, not because the poor and the oppressed and the downtrodden are extra virtuous, but rather because in doing so, we imitate the character of God himself. Because God cares for the lowly and the downtrodden. And in order to do so, God comes into our midst. I was recently reading about a well-known American physician named Paul Farmer. Apparently he's quite famous. I'm surprised I had not heard of him before. He has both an MD and a PhD from Harvard University. He is on the faculty of Harvard University and has attained the rank of full professor. Now, I don't know about you, but I would love to have a PhD from Harvard University and to be on the faculty of Harvard University. What a nice lifestyle that might afford. Paul Farmer divides his time between Boston and Rwanda and Haiti because he sees it as his life's calling to provide quality health care to the poorest of the poor. Why does he do this? He does this because when he was a college student, he read the books of Catholic theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who has spent his entire ministry among the poor of Lima, Peru. Why is he motivated to follow the example of Gutierrez in his life's work? Simple. The character of God. A God who wants to lift up the lowly, and a God who comes into our midst in the person of Jesus to love and care for and guide us. One of the most well-known or famous parts of the Bible is Psalm 8. In the book of Psalms, number 8. It is a prayer to God, possibly written by King David. And in this prayer, there is a rhetorical question to God. Who are we that you should think about us? Who are we that you should visit us? Who am I? Who are we? These are questions that in our culture we are encouraged to ask ourselves. Our culture tells us to find the answers by looking inward and reflecting on our feelings. Now, there may be value in that, and in fact, I should say there is value, but not enough. Because if that was enough, there would not be all the rampant insecurity there is in our society. There would not be the countless numbers of people who feel the need to buy a big house that they can't really afford, or to buy a fancy car they don't really need or like, or to dress in a certain way. Last summer, I conducted a wedding here at the church, and the best man works at a nightclub in Toronto. And he was telling me that he knows countless young people who have gone into debt, literally, so they can go to clubs and wear clothes they can't afford, and drink bottles of champagne they can't even remotely afford, sacrificing their entire futures to gain a little bit of admiration on a Friday or a Saturday night. Who am I and who are we? The most satisfactory answers to those questions we could possibly get come from the good news of our faith, that we are creatures of God, a God who made us and who loves us, a God who has sought us out and wants to make us his own. A God who has come into our midst in Jesus, that we might become his sheep simply by hearing his voice, for he longs to be our shepherd. Amen.